This video covers how to calculate percentages from information in a table. This information comes from a survey of who voted in the last election. We see that it's broken down by groups of people that voted and did not vote, and also broken down by men and women. So we have four different quantities. The 127 is under men and in the row for voted, so it's that many people who voted who were men. And in the 443, we see it's men who did not vote. So there's the group of people who did not vote who were also men. On the column for the women, 103 of the women voted, 377 of the women did not vote. So we can use this information to answer some questions like, what percentage of women voted, or what percentage of voters were women? The two questions sound very similar, but we want to pay attention to the wording. Percentage of women who voted is our first question. So it's asking for a percentage of women. The second question is asking of a percentage of voters. So percentage of something, we're thinking a portion of this group, some part of the group. So percentage of women is saying, think of just the women, how many of those women voted? The second question, asking about a percentage of voters, says, I want you to think only of all the people who voted, men and women. And out of that group, what percentage of those were women? And it's important to notice that in each of these questions, we're not given the number for this total group, percentage of what? The first question, percentage of all the women, we need to actually find the total on our own of all the women. We know how many voted and how many did not vote, but we don't know how many total women there are. And the question asking what percentage of women means that we first need to figure out how many total women there are. That's our reference value. When we say percentage of blank, this group, we do like to know what that amount actually is to be able to determine some other quantities in the question. So percentage of women, we first need to find the total number of women. Asking what percentage of voters, we need to first figure out, well, how many total people voted. So we'll go through the quantities in the table and come up with all the totals of the different groups. Starting with this row, going horizontally, the number of people that voted. We have 127 men, 103 were women, so that means all of our voters, there were 230 of them. The next row would be the people that did not vote. 443 men did not vote, 377 women did not vote, and adding those two numbers gives our total number of non-voters, 820. Next, looking at the columns, men, we had 127 that voted, 443 did not. That was a total of 570 men in this survey. The next column for women, 103 voted, 377 did not. That's a total of 480 women. Now that we have quantities to represent our reference value, the total group that we're looking to find the part of, percentage of women in the first question, we have those totals so we can begin to set up ratios that will lead to our percentages. To answer the first question, what percentage of women voted, we're taking the total number of women as our reference value in the denominator. Now we're asking what percentage of those women actually voted. In the table we can see 103 women voted. Here's our ratio that represents the number of women that voted out of the total number of women. We can divide numerator divided by denominator to turn this fraction into a decimal and then convert it into a percent. As a decimal, 0.21458 and then some 3's continuing after the 8. Let's turn this into a percent and round to the nearest tenth of a percent. Moving the decimal point 2 places, as always, for turning it into a percent. And now this 4 would be in the tenths place. So should this 4 remain a 4, or do we bump it up because the number behind it is 5 or higher? So we're bumping it up to a 5, 21.5%. Now what percentage of voters were women? Now we need to find a total for all the voters, 230 total voters. So the 230 is our reference value in the denominator. To find what percentage of all these voters were women, we see that 103 women voted. The 103 is showing up in each of these ratios because those are the women who voted. And that group is definitely what we're asking about in both questions, women that voted. But the difference is the first question is asking what percentage of those women are they out of all the women. The other question is saying what percentage are those women out of all of the voters. So two different reference values, and we're getting two different ratios and two different percents. Changing this decimal into a percent, 44.783, and this 7 would be in the tenths place after we move our decimal point, and we should bump that 7 up to an 8 because the place behind it is a high number. So 44.8%. And one last comment that we see the difference between the reference values in these two questions. The first one is asking what percent of all the women voted. 21.5% of women voted. And how many of our voters were women? 44.8% of the voters were women. Now pause the video and see if you can work through these two questions. Remember to find our reference value and set up the right ratios. Now let's go through answering these two questions. First, what percentage of the voters were men? We need to spot percentage of the voters. So we're after, for our reference value, the total voters, 230. How many of those voters were men? 127 men voted. So there's our ratio. As a decimal, approximately 0.552, which we changed to 55.2%, rounded to the nearest tenth. The next question, what percentage of men voted? Our reference value would be how many men? Total, 570 men. How many of those voted? It's still the same comparison value, 127 men voted. We're just differing whether we compare those to all of the voters or all of the men. In this case, out of all of the men, as a decimal, about 0.2228, and as a percent, round it to the nearest tenths place, 22.3%.